Hello, welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl Christensen, and I am solo podcasting again. I think I haven't done this in a while. Maybe the basics of astronomy was the last one, but I hope it goes well today. I will be discussing the basics of William Shakespeare. So before you think this is going to be your traditional English class, I'm hoping a little bit more relevant to the layman here. We're going to be discussing a little bit of the history, but mostly the ways in which the the plays of William Shakespeare and William Shakespeare himself was influential both in his time and in English culture, American culture now. So we'll go through some of the ways in which Shakespearean plays are influential and relevant and important for the layman to be familiar with. So let's start. Well, I guess before I dig in here, this is a bit of a tribute also to my father, who passed away since the last podcast that we did. Now we did a podcast with my dad about maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, on college English and writing. So the opportunity to go back and listen to what he said. He was an English literature professor, and so, as you can imagine, was a big proponent of Shakespeare. He taught American literature and English, so English literature, including Shakespeare. To clarify, I don't believe that William Shakespeare was an American author. He was an English author, but my dad had the opportunity to teach English literature a number of times, but near the end of his career, focused more on non-Western literature, Chinese poetry, that type of thing. So, but he did have us as children, so me and my brothers, who were the normal co-hosts on this podcast, he had us reading Shakespeare. I have early memories, say as a 7-year-old, of sitting down and reading Shakespeare. So it was an important part of my life growing up, and so I thought, in tribute to my dad, I'd talk a little bit about Shakespeare today. So let's talk about who Shakespeare was and a little bit about his biographical information. So, known as the Bard of Avon, Shakespeare was born in April 1564 and raised in Stratford upon Avon, which is in Warwickshire. For those not particularly familiar with the layout of England, Warwickshire is northwest of London, so kind of central to the island of England. So that's where Shakespeare was from. It's unclear where Shakespeare was educated. Probably just there locally at Stratford upon Avon. There's not attendance records or those types of things. So, but we do know at the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway, and they had 3 children. Shakespeare produced most of his works between 1589 and 1613. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about not really the order of plays, just kind of some of his more influential plays and when they were created, when he wrote them. But there is some discrepancy among Shakespearean scholars even as to which play was written and in what order and those types of things. So there is some consensus that the majority of his works, or all of his works, were created between 1589 and 1613, though. So he wrote a total of 38 plays, tragedies, comedies, histories, and 154 sonnets. So sonnets, for the layman, type of poetry, popular back then, and still popular now. And then he also wrote 2 narrative poems, which did enjoy success even back in his day. and then some other verses as well. So pretty prolific as far as the playwright is concerned back then. However, so there are instances of Shakespeare's plays being published and acted out during his life. He even actually, something I learned in doing research for this podcast, was that he himself was an actor and even played in some of his own plays, acted in some of his own plays. So, but the first compilation of all of his works was in the year 1623, known as the First Folio. It was compiled by two friends and fellow actors of his, Henry Condell and John Hemmings. And it was a posthumous collection. So after he died, collected and included all but two of his plays. So not entirely sure in my research why it only included 36. Maybe the authorship of the other two were not attributed. Anyway, he wrote 38 plays, but 36 are in the First Folio. The two that are left out were the Two Noble Kinsmen and Pericles and the Prince of Tyre. The preface of the First Folio was a poem, by Ben Jonson, who was a notable playwright back in those days. Hail Shakespeare, with the now famous quote, "Not of an age, but for all time." It's very prescient. As obviously that has borne out to be correct. So not just for an age, but now 400 years, more than 400 years down the road, still noted as probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, author in English literature. So his works comprise more than 1 million, 1 million words. Like I said, pretty prolific. He, though, didn't just write, like I said, just the plays and the sonnets. He was also formative in the in standardization or creation of English words and grammar. So he, these come from his new words, his phrases, the way he used grammar were all very new. And so Samuel Johnson created a dictionary. So maybe you're familiar with the author of his dictionary in the English language. The first serious dictionary quoted Shakespeare more than any other author. And expressions like "with bated breath" and "a foregone conclusion" are from William Shakespeare. So we're going to talk about a few other of the quotes that came from him as well. So while Shakespeare was obviously known as a playwright and author, you could argue that he was also a lexicographer, or someone that essentially wrote words. It says about 1,700 words introduced by Shakespeare are still used in English today. 1,700. I mean, that is a very large number. Bedroom. There are a lot of words that Shakespeare came up with that we still use frequently, and they're words that you are familiar with, and that you would be surprised didn't predate Shakespeare. At least I was surprised. There's critic, lackluster, lonely, unaware. Just adding the "un" prefix to words, so unreal, uncomfortable. So these are words that you'd have imagined were in the language beforehand, but hadn't been used, or at least hadn't been really written down beforehand, and then just words that became so lackluster. Using elbow as a verb, to elbow someone, dwindle, all of those words coined by Shakespeare. So like I said, very influential beyond just the plays. Actually, the way he used the language was very formative. Let's see. So Shakespeare, as you can imagine, remains the world's best-selling playwright. Sales of his plays and poetry are believed to have achieved in excess of 4 billion copies in the last 400 years. So that's I don't know what it requires to be on the New York bestsellers list. I'd imagine it's significantly less than 4 billion. So I have the complete works of William Shakespeare sitting on my nightstand. So I can certainly believe that over the last 400 years, lots of people are in a similar situation as I am. He's also the third most translated author in history. So not just in the English speaking countries is Shakespeare influential. As I was doing my research, I also saw that he, in a particular period in Germany, was enjoyed. His plays were played in various theaters across Germany. So, and I'm sure that's true both now and in lots of other countries as well. So it's not just an English literature influence that Shakespeare had, but across the literature scene and across plays across the world. Shakespeare's standard poetic form was something you probably learned in English class, right? It's called iambic pentameter. And this means that the verse was usually unrhymed and consisted of 10 syllables to a line and spoken with the stress on every second syllable. So da-dun, 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 da-dun. And that's what you probably once again learned in English class. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about iambic pentameter, but that's his standard poetic form used both in his plays and in his sonnets. And it is incredible that he wrote, these so over 1 million words, and they're not all in iambic pentameter, but almost all, is my understanding. So he, let's see, the sonnets were the last of Shakespeare's non-dramatic works to be printed in 1609, but there was evidence that Shakespeare wrote sonnets throughout his career for a private readership. What exactly that means is probably, your guess is probably as good as mine, but apparently he was just wrote and published his sonnets throughout his life, but then a compilation was published in 1609. Of particular relevance to today's audience, in light of the pandemic that we've been dealing with for the last, what has it been now, 2 years or more, there was the bubonic plague that Shakespeare and Shakespeare's plays had to contend with. And so while we've been subject to closed theaters, closed movie theaters in the last 2 years, Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays dealt with something similar. A bubonic plague ravaged England throughout the early 1600s. So, playhouses were repeatedly closed during outbreaks. So Shakespeare had to deal with that in a similar way that today we have had to deal with that. So I thought it was interesting that there is that this happens, over the course of centuries as well. That this is not just a modern day issue. But yeah, the plague was horrendous, killed lots of people, and so they'd close playhouses, and Shakespeare then would either have to just go back and write, because then would no longer obviously be able to act. So he retired in 1613, and the Globe Theatre, which I think a lot of us can associate with Shakespeare. That's the theater that most of his plays were written for. He was actually, and this is something I learned in doing the research, he was part of a group of actors that owned and built the Globe Theatre, and that actually allowed Shakespeare to become quite wealthy. That this group that he was associated with built the Globe, and it's on the south bank of the River Thames, and that was in the year 1599. And so he was able to go and buy a very large house. And well, a lot of playwrights were struggling with being quite poor. Shakespeare didn't have that same issue because of this association he had with this group that owned the theater. Said he acted in some of his own plays even after he was quite successful. And then he died on April 23rd, 1616, of an unknown cause. So about a month, I think it was almost exactly a month before he passed away, he signed his will, and stated that he was in perfect health. So that was 1 month before. So there's one, I believe, record written by someone that knew him that said that he had gone drinking a lot and that he had acquired a fever as a result of that. And it sounds anecdotal to me. I don't think there's no particular reason to believe that there was anything associated with that, but no particular cause known of his death in 1616. He had 3 children, as I already mentioned, but none of his grandchildren had children. So his line ended in the year 1670, so no direct descendants of Shakespeare today. He was buried in the Holy Trinity Church 2 days after his death, and that's where his remains are now. Another note about the Globe Theatre. So this happened actually before Shakespeare died, but right after he retired, the Globe Theatre burned down during performance of Henry VIII, the 29th of June in 1613. So just right after Shakespeare retired, the Globe Theatre burned down. It has been rebuilt. I don't remember the year. I was over in England a long time ago and saw the rebuilt Globe. So I don't know what year that is, but it has been reconstructed, I believe, to mirror the original Globe Theatre from Shakespeare's day. Okay, so that's a little bit about Shakespeare's life. Let's talk a little bit more about his work. And so his early plays were primarily comedies or histories. And then later more tragedies, and then what they call problem plays, which are some tragedy, some comedy. But the tragedies wrote in early 1600s, those obviously include what most people see as the peak of his career. We've got Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. All of those essentially vying for some of the most influential and best known works of English literature ever. Those are, I'm going to talk a little bit later in the podcast about a few of the ones I think the layman should take the time to read. But obviously you can imagine that those are going to be some of the ones that are most influential, are those tragedies. So let's talk about a few of the questions about Shakespeare, a few of the things that are kind of, I wouldn't say directly controversial, but a little bit unclear as to where and how these things happened during his life. So Shakespeare, his religion, back in the 1600s in England, by law, you were required to be of the Church of England. There was some question as to whether or not Shakespeare was actually essentially a closet Catholic. A Shakespearean scholar, though, A.L. Rouse, was emphatic when he said he died as he lived, a conforming member of the Church of England. His will made that perfectly clear, put it beyond dispute, for it uses the Protestant formula. So, while there is some question about Shakespeare's parents being closet Catholics, and some evidence that would lean that way, as far as I was able to tell, there's no particular evidence that shows that Shakespeare himself was anything more than a conforming member of the Church of England, like Mr. Rouse says. So, one of the big questions in Shakespearean research is actually into whether or not William Shakespeare was actually the author of the sonnets and plays attributed to him. This sounds conspiracy theory-esque, but this is more than your normal conspiracy theory because this has lots of otherwise very well-known people that have argued for other authors to actually be the true author of these plays and sonnets. Mark Twain argued for Francis Bacon. We'll talk about a few of these names. Helen Keller agreed. Sigmund Freud, Walt Whitman, Sandra Day O'Connor. I mean, people even recently, my dad, who I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, was an English literature professor at one point, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, maybe 15, did tell me also that he saw some pretty good, what he viewed as good evidence to show that maybe Shakespeare was not the actual author, though he didn't mention it much after that, so I think he may have then at some point gone back to just the default that William Shakespeare was the author. There are particular reasons why people believe that it was a different author, and that's mostly having to do with the lack of education. William Shakespeare, we don't have record of him, going to being university educated, having experience with courts, things that you would need to know in order to write the plays that Shakespeare wrote. So some people have put forward Francis Bacon or the playwright Christopher Marlowe. In the last 90 years, Edward de Vere, who's the 17th Earl of Oxford, has been kind of the favored name. And Oxford, he was Oxford trained, highly educated, worked as a lawyer, traveled to a lot of the places that Shakespeare's plays happened. So de Vere is one of the big names. I believe that's the one my dad mentioned to me. But there are, like I said, multiple candidates that people put forward. The interesting thing is that during Shakespeare's day, it was attributed to William Shakespeare, and there wasn't actually any doubt raised to whether or not it was a different author until 200 years after the first folio, the first compilation of his works, was published. So all of the contemporary playwrights seem to have been fine with the idea that it actually was William Shakespeare. And for what that's worth, it convinces me. There were other women also put forward as potential candidates. Amelia Bassano. The name Amelia it appears in multiple plays written by Shakespeare, and it was an uncommon name, so that people think that that's one potential sign that it could have been her. And some details about Bassano's life also seem to be elements in some of the plays as well. So that's why some people put her forward as a potential name. Mary Sidney, another name. She had the education, she had the time in court, and that she could have been available to write as well. So, but like I said, after the fact that the playwrights that lived in Shakespeare's time attributed to William Shakespeare, say that to me it wasn't just a front. So the idea that someone else wrote it and then just wrote William Shakespeare as the name and it kind of put him up as a front man because for one reason or another they didn't want to be known as the author of these plays, doesn't really hold water in light of people actually knowing the man. He acted in his own plays. Playwrights obviously interacted with him and they attributed the works to him. So if he had been illiterate, if he hadn't been able to talk about his own plays, you'd imagine that would have raised some questions back in that day. So this post hoc analysis of his plays to attribute them to a different author seems a bit unnecessary to me. I understand that the education question is there, but savants are often not not classically educated or not don't adhere to other norms that we'd like to put on them. So, that's just the case that's what I think is probably the more, once again, going back to our Razor's podcast, or the most likely explanation is just that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. So, but yeah, that's the authorship question. Let's talk a little bit about a few of the quotes. I mentioned, like, so he coined a lot of words, but there are some quotes and just kind of phrases that we are familiar with, that we hear all the time, that I believe the layman should be familiar with, as far as where it came from and why it's in the zeitgeist. The obviously, to be or not to be, that is the question, comes from Hamlet. I believe even the layman knows that. Beware the Ides of March, from Julius Caesar. Valor, the better part of valor is discretion, from Henry IV. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war, from Julius Caesar. Brevity is the soul of wit, from Hamlet. A man can die but once, from Henry IV. Frailty, thy name is woman, from Hamlet. I said we could go on and on with these quotes, and like, some of these would be more or less familiar to you. Et tu, Brute, from Julius Caesar. But there are so many quotes that are so frequently referenced in modern culture and in literature that it's astounding how influential Shakespeare was in that way. So for the layman, that's relevant. That the more that you're familiar with these plays, the better context you'll have for when these quotes are made. I know my dad, once again, it's kind of a tribute to him. He read us the works of P.G. Wodehouse frequently. It's a British author, early 20th century author, and Wodehouse quoted Shakespeare extensively, lots of quotes. Wodehouse was a comedic author, lots of funny books, Jeeves and Wooster, if you're familiar with that series. Anyway, just lots and lots of references, though, to Shakespeare, and so that's just one example of if you hadn't been at all familiar with the Shakespearean quotes, a lot of those things are then lost on you. So, as far as outside of literature and more in kind of modern culture, a layman might be interested to know that there are a lot of movies and TV series that are based on Shakespearean plays and or riffs on themes from Shakespeare. And so some of these you might know, some might not. As far as movies go, we've got the Lion King. That one actually I hadn't really processed that myself before I was doing the research for this, and then I had to sit back and think for a second. Oh, actually that makes a lot of sense. If you know the story, the plot of Hamlet, it's father dies, uncle to blame. Anyway, that's the Lion King is one of those movies. 10 Things I Hate About You, She's the Man, West Side Story. All of those are takes on Shakespearean plays. As far as TV series, and maybe even ones that are more relevant for now, you've got Breaking Bad. Now, whether or not that's specifically based on Shakespearean play, Macbeth, or not, it is certainly similar themes. So that's one that you can, whether or not it directly drew from Macbeth is unclear, but it, like I said, similar ideas. But one that certainly did take directly from Shakespeare and is, the writer said so, and relevant to modern culture is Game of Thrones. So the author George R.R. Martin said Shakespeare has played a part in influencing his own writing. And so you can see in Game of Thrones inspiration from Richard III. So that's an example, once again, of how Shakespeare influences modern culture still. So even if you don't get into literature a lot, you can see that that's the case, that it's still relevant for watching TV. A few more, so I wanted to just hit a few plays that I think the layman needs to put on his list of things to read, things to do. I'm going to give you dates. I think at the beginning of the podcast I said I'd talk about some of the order. I'm just going to give you the dates of some of these ones that I believe the layman should take the time to read. Some of these dates, like I said, are a little bit they're not entirely nailed down, but kind of give you an idea of when and how they were written. But for those laymen that are now going to say, okay, well, this list is going to be irrelevant. I've tried reading a lot of Shakespeare in the past. Look into the modern language version of Shakespeare. There's some updated, essentially, translations of Shakespeare that don't use the words that we don't use. That some of the 17th century English that is essentially unintelligible to a lot of laymen these days. It makes it very intractable, very difficult to read Shakespeare. So find that modern translation of these plays. They exist, they're online, and that will help you kind of get into Shakespeare a little bit more without losing you still get the plot, you get a lot of the quotes, but you don't have to deal with trying to learn almost a new language in some ways, or at least a version of English that is not really relevant in today's society. So a few of the plays that I highly recommend. Let's start with a few tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, written in 1595-ish. The number of riffs and just remakes of Romeo and Juliet are numerous. Both plays and books rewritten on the subject. It's all over the place. And so that the references to Romeo and Juliet are also ubiquitous. So I think that's one worth your time. Let's see. Big surprise, Hamlet is also going to be on this list. Obviously, maybe you've read that in high school. If you took any high school English class, you probably required reading, written probably around the turn of the 17th century, so the year 1600. That one is obviously listed by many as the best work of William Shakespeare. So if you're going to read only one, that would be the one. Also a tragedy. Macbeth, also among the list of some of his Shakespeare's best works, written around the year 1606. Moving tragedy. And then let's do one more tragedy here. So Antony and Cleopatra, historical tragedy, written probably around 1606 or 1607. That's got some quotes and then historical information. I think that would be very relevant for the layman. Like I said, we're leaving. Oh, and then Julius Caesar. Can't leave Julius Caesar out, written around 1599. And I read that about 8 or 9 years ago for the first time. And there's just so many phrases and ideas in there that are so relevant in society today that I think it's well worth your read. One or two comedies that I think would be great for the layman. Twelfth Night, written in the year 1601. I've seen that performed in England and in Utah in the United States. So it's a crowd pleaser, performed all over the place because it's just an easy one to enjoy. And then A Midsummer Night's Dream, once again, also kind of just a magical, fun crowd pleaser that fun and a comedy that even children can kind of enjoy. So those are a few of the plays that I think that are worth the layman's time. If you've got more time, keep digging in, because that list could go on for another 15 or 20 before we even start getting to ones that that only an English major would read. So many of these are really very relevant in today's culture, so many that I can't list them all, right? But I think that will essentially take us to the end here. I do, once again, thank my dad for the time that he spent educating me on Shakespeare. And hopefully this has been, if you didn't come into this podcast with a love of Shakespeare, hopefully you have at least some interest in Shakespeare now. If not, either way, I appreciate you listening all the way to the end. And please find us on Spotify, follow us there, review us on iTunes, do all of those things. And then on Facebook, let us know what you actually want us to hear. We're going to be finishing up our World War II podcast from Midway, the Battle of Midway, to the end. Will be our next podcast after this. So if you haven't listened to the first part of that, go ahead and do that as well. I highly recommend. And until then, go and read some Shakespeare.